Live to talk a little bit more about this is our West Asia Bureau Chief, Daniele Pagani, live with us from Jerusalem. And also with us is Dr. Toby Greene, Research Fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations, also joining us from Jerusalem. And Daniele, if I can just come to you briefly first, what is the latest that you're picking up now? We believe that all in all, it is a victory for Benjamin Netanyahu, even if some of the results are not out.
Yes, definitely. So it is a victory for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, even if we have to underline and say that Benny Gantz put up a very, very hard fight. Imagine that he just started campaigning massively a few months before the election. He has no political expertise. He is, so to say, an outsider. Well, not really an outsider. He was the former chief of staff, so he was part of the Israeli establishment. But in terms of civilian politics, he was an outsider. No doubt, nevertheless, this is a success of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Why so? Because the coalition that he will be most likely able to form is all set to win. He could achieve with other right-wing parties which were already part of his governing coalition before this election, number which goes between 63 to 67 seats, which is more or less 10 seats more than any other coalition which could eventually be formed. So yes, he survived the very tough elections where the possible indictment for bribery and corruption was a very, very heavy weight which was hanging on his head. So, yeah, we can safely say that this is a victory, and he is set, despite 3% of the votes missing, he is all set to become the Israeli Prime Minister once again for the 5th time.
Right. And Dr. Toby Greene now, I just want to, regardless of the outcome, of course, Benny Gantz has had a remarkable run here. What next for him? Will he sit in opposition, or do you think he will actually join the cabinet of Benjamin Netanyahu, as some reports are suggesting? What do you think happens next year?
Well, there is a tradition in Israel of national unity governments where you have the two largest parties joining together in government, especially when those two large parties are of equal size, which you have in this case. However, Benny Gantz did, when pressed during the election campaign, admit that he would not join a coalition led by the current Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, because of the threat of indictment that is hanging over Netanyahu in 3 separate cases. So it would be a major reversal of a campaign promise where Gantz to now reverse that and enter into a coalition. So I think that it is more likely that he will try to lead his newly formed party in the opposition. But it's worth bearing in mind that that large opposition party, the Blue and White Party, is actually itself a coalition of 3 separate parties. So whether that Blue and White coalition will hang together in opposition is another question.
And Daniele Pagani, now this has been, of course, a divisive campaign. You know, at some point Benny Gantz is also called a sympathizer of the Arab world. Having said all of that, what was the real differentiator here between Benny Gantz and Netanyahu in terms of policies?
I think that at least within the Israeli sentiment among the people I have interacted to, the very divisive politics, the very divisive element was respectability. So many saw Benny Gantz as a possible change. They didn't see very favorably the fact that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was leading the country for over a decade. They felt that this was possibly a threat to the Israeli democracy. And also they felt that the possible cases that he will have to fight, if he will actually have to fight these cases, would eventually bring to and lead into another crisis and another vote and another government. So this was what made many Israelis to vote for Benny Gantz. But many others also told me that they were definitely voting for continuity and stability, and that anyway Benjamin Netanyahu proved to be capable of running the country, and therefore they felt like it was once again time to support him.
And Dr. Toby Greene, now this is of course a fresh, renewed mandate for Netanyahu. What does that mean for the Middle East? What does that mean for the American push in the Middle East as well?
Well, I think for the Middle East, from a regional perspective, I think essentially it means continuity. Although with some qualifiers to that, there is on the horizon this potential for Donald Trump to launch a long-promised peace initiative. We don't know exactly what the contents of that will be or how the Israeli government will respond. It's also true that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in the last days of the campaign, when he was trying to ensure that he would win support from the right-wing base, made comments in the direction of moving towards annexing certain parts of the West Bank or settlements in the West Bank. But whether that will actually be implemented in office, I think is far from clear. Perhaps more likely, I think, is mostly continuity. However, the key qualifier to that is, although Netanyahu has won a significant victory here, it may be temporary because the threat of indictment facing him is very serious. The Attorney General has said that he intends to indict Netanyahu pending a hearing, and that will happen in certainly less than a year. So one of the big questions facing Israel now is whether the coalition that we expect Netanyahu will be able to form will actually continue to support him if he is indeed indicted. Mm-hmm. If he attempts, if he attempts to avoid indictment with legislative measures, will the small parties in the coalition back him in that respect? Okay,
so Daniele, then the question, of course, also arises whether he's going to be then vulnerable to sort of coalition pressures and extortion when it comes to those indictment charges, and also very briefly touch upon, of course, the kind of support he's got from Donald Trump and all through his own campaign.
Well, definitely Donald Trump, even if indirectly advocated for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to win. Why? So continuity in foreign policy is always very much more manageable than discontinuity. So even though Donald Trump said that also Benny Gantz would have been a viable and possible and good option, he definitely wanted, through giving the Golan Heights, through moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, cutting the funds to the UNRWA, the UN agency in charge of the
All right, Daniele Pagani, they're making an important point about Donald Trump's renewed support for Netanyahu all through the campaign.